Students of the Thomistic Institute chapter basically determine the title of the talks or what the talks are about from a sort of menu that we provide for them. And this was one of the menu items on my biography, so that they asked me to speak on this. Of course, when you talk about purgatory, when you talk about anything and you have St. Thomas in the background, it's never just talking about that one thing. Right? It's talking about everything to get to that one thing. And that's going to happen to us a little bit tonight. So there's just a brief outline of what we want to do this evening. First, we're going to give just a brief word on human nature. St. Thomas would understand it. Then we'll talk about the consequences of sin, the nature of judgment and punishment. And then finally, we'll get to purgatory. Right? Why, what it is, and how long. These sort of Thomistic Institute lectures are intended really to be really introductions to some fascinating topics, especially when we're talking about St. Thomas. I'm sure you can appreciate and understand that if you were taking a class at the Dominican House of Studies, where I'm the president and where we train our brothers and a number of students from religious orders and among the laity to be scholars and priests and evangelizers, it would be at least several weeks of material just to talk about this, right? Just to talk about this. So I have like 45 minutes, okay? So just want to keep that as a preface here. So moving on, just a little bit about the human composite. And for many of you, and I'm having had dinner this evening with some of the students of the Thomistic Institute chapter, I know that much of what I'm going to say here is not news to most of you, but will be by way of review. Remember, for St. Thomas, following Aristotle, the intellectual soul is united by its very being to the body as form. The soul is the form of the body. Now, this has a number of ramifications for St. Thomas's understanding of the human person and his understanding of morality, his understanding of knowledge, and the pursuit of truth and happiness. It also has a number of ramifications for his sacramental theology and for Christology. I mean, this is a sort of a key point for St. Thomas. The soul is the form of the body. And the soul, so the body not only needs the soul because it is the form of the body, but the soul is also such that it needs the body in a certain sense. It needs the body for knowledge and for locomotion or for movement. All knowledge, and here St. Thomas is of course borrowing from Aristotle, all knowledge begins with the senses, right? And for Aristotle, Aristotle speaks of two different kinds of senses, the exterior senses and the interior senses. St. Thomas takes that up. So the exterior senses, the five senses that we all learned about in grade school, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling. But to that, Aristotle and Aquinas with him adds several other interior senses like imagination and memory and what he calls the common sense. So basically for St. Thomas, the way the body works in gaining knowledge is that knowledge, and to use a more contemporary word, data, if you will, is brought in through one of the, or multiple of the five senses. You know, this podium looks a certain way, it feels a certain way when I touch it. I'm not going to smell it. But it looks a certain way, it feels a little way, I'm certainly not going to taste it, right? And then that all gets sort of put together interiorly by the common sense, so that this podium, you know, my mind now knows that it looks this way, it feels this way, right? And then the soul can work on certain things to come to further knowledge, which I'll move on to in a minute, just briefly. But even though the soul needs the body for knowledge and for movement, the soul's activities transcend the material, right? So abstract thought, rational love, these are not just simply synapses firing in the brain for St. Thomas. These are not simply just material sensations, even though they often are accompanied by material sensations. And even though you need the imagination to, in fact, engage in abstract thought. Whether I ask you to think about God and you have a mental image of something that you're thinking about, whether it's an old man with a white robe and a white beard, or whether I'm talking to you about love or freedom or truth. The human person is such that we cannot grow in knowledge and truth without actual mental work, without an interior work, which is to say an interior life without an imagination, and that's why some people are in some ways smarter and more clever than other people. Sometimes people, not only do they know more or learn more, but they're also able to have more vivid imaginations. They're more clever in putting things together interiorly, right? I mean, we experience this in school when, friends seem to catch abstract concepts quicker than you do, all of that's at work. Now that doesn't mean, and all of that's part of the body's work. The brain, the imagination is all part of the body. St. Thomas would not be surprised if he were alive today to go into a hospital and watch someone get a CAT scan and see that certain parts of the brain light up when they're thinking certain things. Would not be surprised at all. However, making that jump to real knowledge, understanding love and truth and freedom, is more than just what the imagination can do, even though the imagination is necessary to understand it. Right? Universal knowledge is more than what the body can do. That's how the soul transcends the material. So St. Thomas says, it's natural for the soul to understand by turning to the phantasms as it is for it to be joined to the body. The soul needs the body to even understand. But to be separated from the body is not in accordance with its nature, with the soul's nature. And likewise, to understand without turning to phantasms is not natural to it. This leads to, of course, a lot of interesting questions in St. Thomas that we got into a little bit at dinner before the talk about the nature of the soul in the beatific vision before the resurrection, the general resurrection. Right? Otherwise, if it were true that the body only needed the soul for life, to be alive, and to be what it is, and the soul didn't need the body for anything, it would bring us back to a sort of Gnosticism in which the soul, like Descartes, is simply the captain of the machine. Right? So one thing I hope that you'll take away from this evening is that for St. Thomas, the body and the soul are principles of identity and principles of the human person. We are neither not just a body and neither just a soul. We are a body soul. All right. For St. Thomas, we are a composite. And while that seems very simple to accept, it's difficult to understand or live often in our modern milieu precisely because we live in a post-Cartesian world that sees the true me, the true soul, as something deeper than my body and something other than my body. For St. Thomas, it's not that the soul is in the body, rather the body is in the soul. Because the soul is what makes the body to be what it is. The body and soul need each other. Now, what does this mean for the goal of things? For St. Thomas, all things have an aptitude or a proportion to an end, a goal or a telos, which is to say that there are things that are connatural, that are naturally suitable as something that our human nature will be fulfilled in. Some things, not just one thing, although God is that one thing, there also are other goods and other things, right, that are connatural, suitable to be fulfilled in, suitable to pursue. For St. Thomas, love, in its most primal sense, is this principle of movement towards a connatural end, and towards an end desired, and hopefully a good end, a true end, a connatural end, and not an unnatural end. And each of the powers in the human person have their own connatural end. So the intellect is made to pursue truth. Right? The will is made to pursue goodness. It's called a rational appetite because it follows the intellect. But then, of course, we also have the lower powers, our passions. I am hesitant to use the word emotions, but that's our more modern understanding. But the lower powers, our passions. Here's the thing to know about this, is that the powers, our passions, are malleable. Just as our will is malleable, but in a much longer, more often a longer pursuit. We can become attracted to things that we weren't attracted to before. We can become to be repulsed by things that we weren't repulsed to before. I hate liver and onions. My mother gave me liver and onions when I was 7 years old. See, I tried it once when I was 19, still hated it. Tried it about 5 years ago again, just I thought I've gotten older, I can certainly eat liver and onions. Nope. Not happening. Even the smell is repulsive, right? All right, so my passions, my taste buds, there are other things I have grown to like coffee and espresso, which I would not have liked as a teenager even. So our powers are malleable, our lower powers are malleable. We're attracted to and repulsed by things. The thing to focus on here is that while we share these with animals, the passions are neither good nor evil except as when they are directed by the intellect or the will, or they interfere with that process. Right? Now, what is the goal then of our life? Well, the pursuit of happiness is what St. Thomas says. I always tell my students that when St. Thomas talks about morality in the second part of the Summa, which is the largest part of the Summa, it's not about rules or obligations or duties. It's about two questions. What's going to make me happy and how do I get it? That's all of morality for St. Thomas. Now that takes him a couple hundred questions to answer. But what is morality and how do I get it? So happiness for St. Thomas is having everything sort of in us actualized to the full. Our pursuit of knowledge, our pursuit of love and goodness, all of our desires in the best possible ways, which of course is what is going to make us fully and uniquely human. Right? Now for Aristotle, that simply meant going through life reasoning well and choosing well. But for St. Thomas, as a man of faith, we know that it's union with God, right? That moment when he appears and we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. This is how we were created. St. Thomas is unwavering in this fact. And so he's actually quite the optimist. Even in our culture today, I still think he'd be quite the optimist that the human person is hardwired to pursue God, hardwired for truth, hardwired for the good. Even if we make mistakes along the way of knowing what is true goodness, what is truth, what is authentic love. And even if knowing those things, we make mistakes in pursuing them and how we try to achieve them and receive them. Right? Now, moving forward then to sin. To begin with, how we're created. If there were a second thing I'd hope you'd remember tonight, the first being that the human person is a composite of body and soul, I'd want you to remember that Adam and Eve were created in a state of grace. They were not created in a purely natural moment. All right? That state was called original justice. That's what St. Thomas calls it. It's what the Catechism calls it. And that state is not... It's something, for St. Thomas, it's a gift of their nature, but it's also, in fact, a gift of his nature due to them by the way God has created us. And it's detailed in three specific ways. The reason of Adam and Eve were entirely subject to God. Their lower powers were subject to reason, and the body was subject to the soul. That's how we're supposed to be. That's what the human being is supposed to be. The way you and I live with original sin is a derivative of what humanity was created to be. So often I think we can sometimes think of the human relationship with God as something that's neutral. Like people can choose to believe in God or not believe in God. And while in a way that's true, but it's more false than true. Because in fact, we're not created neutral. We're created for God. Every human person is created to be in relationship with God, and the human species was created in a graced relationship with God. Unique to them. So in right relationship with God, the human person then is in right relation to himself. All of this, of course, is lost with original sin. Not because original sin is a positive inclination, but because original sin is a violation of the covenant and therefore a denial of the gift of grace, of the original justice as a grace. And the three effects correspond to the three aspects of original justice. The intellect is darkened, the will is weakened, the passions are inflamed, the body is at war with the soul. in essence, the human person is born, we forget who we are. We're discombobulated. This is why it's so difficult for people often to find the path to true happiness now. It's no longer intuitive. One 20th century Dominican commentator said this, that human nature after original sin is just itself. It's just itself left to itself. And because we're malleable. Because we're malleable and because this world has so many good, beautiful, lovely things, it's very easy for us to flit from one thing to the next without any order and without any direction. Even without sin, but never completely without sin. Right? Now, grace changes all of this for us, the new grace of Jesus Christ. Not that first grace of original justice, which we don't get back. Sorry, those days are over. We don't get original justice back. So Christ brings grace. And for St. Thomas, grace is a quality of the soul, he says. It's like a new quality of existence, of being. He says that grace, some of you, those of you studying Aristotle, Thomas on virtues is a habit, right? Virtues are a habit. So for St. Thomas, virtues are what he calls an operative habit. They're habits of action and operation. Grace is also a habit for St. Thomas. He says grace is an entitative habit. It's a grace of being. And he says it's more like, it's akin to health. Health is an entitative habit. You're either healthy or you're not. And if you're healthy, you're well-functioning and working well. Grace is like a new kind of health that permeates your life, permeates you, and gives you new principles by which you can act. The new principles of faith, hope, and love, the infused moral virtues, the gifts of the Spirit. And so grace brings us then a new relationship with God, not simply as prime mover, but as one who is beloved. Grace brings, and when grace is operative in us, charity is operative, and for St. Thomas, charity, remember, is friendship with God. And already a certain union of wills with God in this life, if not yet perfected in the next. Grace works in the soul. It works interiorly. This is Saint Paul, right? Grace renews the mind. This is why grace does not work in the body. This is why we still suffer the effects of original sin, like a darkened intellect and a weakened will and arthritis, and sensual temptations. Baptism does not remove the effects of original sin. I mean, a good question to ask is, why not? And of course, St. Thomas was fond of asking such questions. He says he thinks there are three reasons why we still have to suffer the effects of original sin, even after we've been baptized and freed from the guilt of original sin. He said, first, suffering the effects of original sin allows us to share in Christ's suffering, who suffered for our sins. So we can endure it and unite our sufferings to his. Secondly, suffering the effects of original sin can be transformative for us. We actually can grow closer to God in our sufferings. And then the third, which is kind of humorous but impressive that he would think in these terms, if baptism took away all suffering, like arthritis and growing old and all of this, he thinks that there'd be a lot of people getting baptized just for those reasons, and not because they came to know, love, and believe in Jesus Christ. Sin. Sin is unique to rational creatures, to you and me and to the angels, the demons. Spiritual substances. Obviously, the angels haven't sinned. Remember that the will, our rational appetite, is always pursuing goodness and perfection. But the problem is, the way we pursue goodness is not always rightly ordered. Sometimes we're ignorant. What we think we're pursuing is to be good is not really truly good. Sometimes we're in error about what the truth is that we're pursuing. And sometimes we have desires that overpower our otherwise rational adjudication, our rational judgments. Now, one of the key points, we can do a whole session just on evil, God and evil, but just take my word for it on this point here, and then I'll explain a little bit as we move on. A salient point that gets a lot of people mixed up with St. Thomas is the relationship God has to evil, which is, even talking about it that way is kind of problematic. Simply to say that God does not cause evil, even though he sustains the creature doing evil in existence. And even though, I don't have a bullet point for this, but I will say this in a minute, we'll talk about this in a minute. Even though God is also the prime mover of the evil action, the sinful action, he is still not responsible for the evil. Because for St. Thomas, sin is a deficiency in the voluntary action. Here, let me give you a quote from the Summa here. Evil, St. Thomas says, which comes from the withdrawal, there's a typo there, I think, which comes from the withdrawal of the form and integrity of the thing, has the nature of a pain suffered. This is a physical evil. We often think about this in physical evil. You know, somebody's born without an arm. That's a pain suffered. That's an evil suffered. Not to say the child is evil, but it should have 2 arms, right? It is the very nature of pain to be against the will. But the evil that consists in the subtraction of the due operation in voluntary things has the nature of a fault. For this is imputed to anyone as a fault to fail as regard perfect action, of which he is the master of by the will. What does that mean? That every choice we make has to have certain elements. And if it's missing one of those elements, it's a sin, it's evil. It's got to be pursuing a true good, at least what you perceive to be a true good in good conscience. And the action that you're choosing has to be properly proportioned to achieve that good and can't be evil in itself, right? Now, how does this work with the relationship of God to our sins and evil? Here's another quote. Therefore, we need to say that God, since he is the first source, this is the De Malo, since he is the first source of the movement of everything, moves certain things in such a way that they also move their very selves, as in the case of those with the power of free choice. So while God is prime mover, he can move in us in such a way that we still kind of move ourselves, even though he is the first mover of all things. And if those with free choice be properly disposed and rightly ordered to receive movement from God by God, good acts will result. And we completely trace these acts to him as their cause. So St. Thomas says when you do good things, actually God is the cause of it. When you don't do good things, you're the cause. People don't think that sounds fair, but here's what he says. But if those with free choice should defect from the requisite order, disordered acts that are acts of sin results. And so we trace what regards the activity of those with the power of free choice to God as the cause, while only free choice, not God, causes what regards the disorder or deformity of those with the power of free choice. And that is why we say that acts of good come from God, but that sin does not. So, God is causing everything to move because we have the unique power of free choice. When his movements come to us, we can actually we are able to divert that movement using our free choice away from its proper end, its proper ordering. And that's what sin is. And it's the experience we all have of sin, especially serious sin, when we find ourselves thinking about sinning and knowing we shouldn't, and what do? Well, I don't want to think about it. I'm not going to think about that. I'm diverting the directionality. Does that make sense? Now, the consequences of sin. Obviously, the original sin, which we've spoken about, but also there are consequences of mortal sin. Turning away from God and turning towards the creature. And we can think of 4 things, St. Thomas says, that are consequences of mortal sin. First, obviously, is the most serious. It's spiritual death. It's the loss of grace and the loss of charity. Mortal sins actually dispose us to commit more sins because we're malleable. Hopefully, mortal sin also brings with it, by God's grace, remorse. Remorse can be perfect or imperfect. Remorse because I'm going to be punished, or remorse because I failed in the love of God. And then, of course, a real consequence of mortal sin is the debt of punishment, which we'll talk about shortly. Venial sins also have their own consequences. While venial sins are not a turning away from God, they are still a sort of turning towards creatures. So the turning away from God may be present in venial sins, but not completely fulfilled. Charity remains. There can still be remorse and the debt of punishment. But the thing about venial sins is that they're easily forgiven by charity, by simply saying an act of contrition or, Lord Jesus, forgive me. Right? This is an important point, though, about venial sin, because St. Thomas thinks that you can get above mortal sin in this life. All right? Like, getting above mortal sin is 101, because mortal sin is very much sin that begins in the soul, in the mind. And that's where grace is primarily at work. Venial sin is very often has a material or bodily element where grace is not working. So the good news is you can get beyond mortal sin in this life. The bad news is you're never going to get beyond all your venial sins. He's got this great line. As you work on one, like gluttony, before you know it, you look around and now you're suffering from vainglory because you're beating gluttony. Right? So that's the spiritual life. Getting beyond mortal sin and then spending the rest of your life playing whack-a-mole with the venial sins. All right? But St. Thomas says that it can happen that after someone has committed a venial sin, he will not actually think anything about abandoning the sin or holding on. He'll just not give it another thought. But he thinks perhaps that a triangle has 3 angles equal to 2 right sides, and in this thought he falls asleep and he dies. This could be a problem. Because he has died in a sort of, even though venially, there's still going to be a debt of punishment that is going to be owed to him because he never gave it a second thought. Right? Punishment after forgiveness. There's some scriptural things I just want to point out here. One of the most basic is the forgiveness of Adam and Eve after the fall. They realize they're naked, and then God makes clothes for them, right? Sets them out. He also gives them their punishments. Israelites forgiven for murmuring in the desert, but yet they're still punished to wander in the desert. David is forgiven for his affair with Bathsheba, but the child still dies. Zacchaeus is punished, but he still gives half of his money to the poor. And then this great line from Revelation, those whom I love, I reprove and chasten. Punishment is a sign of God's love, scripturally, always. Punishment is a sign of God's love. For St. Thomas, whenever one thing rises up against another, it suffers some detriment. Therefore, we find that the natural inclination of man is to repress those who rise up against him, to defend ourselves. Now it is evident that all things contained in an order are, in a manner, one in relation to the principle of that order. Consequently, what rises up against an order is put down by that order or by the principle thereof. An insurrection is put down by the order. And because sin is an inordinate act, it is evident that whoever sins commits an offense against an order. Wherefore he is put down in consequence by the same order, which repression is punishment. This would be another conversation, but it's important to understand that the primary purpose of punishment for St. Thomas and for the classical Catholic Christian tradition is not rehabilitation, deterrence, or remediation, but retribution and putting down those who have offended the order, which is why the punishment at least attempts to fit the nature of the crime. Right? We call this the retributive aspect of punishment, which is the attempt to restore the order that was offended by the sin or by the act. And this retributive act can be done in 3 ways and have 3 different aspects for St. Thomas. First, there can be a punishment that is against the sinner's will. An example of that would be sending someone to prison. He doesn't want to go to prison. It's against his will. But there can also be another type of punishment for a sin or an act that is against what's the word St. Thomas is used is against the habitual will, which is to say against the state of life. The child who misbehaves at school is maybe sent to detention, but he also, or instead of being sent to detention, may lose recess, which is part of his happy life, right? For St. Thomas, when we sin, even though not one sin can't do it, we can lose virtue or the perfection of the virtues we've already acquired. A third type of punishment for St. Thomas is actually receiving what you desire, but because what you desire is unnatural, it is actually harmful to you. Getting your lustful desire is all you want. Sometimes in the spiritual life, God, in fact, lets sinners remain in their sin precisely so they can receive the negative effects of what they think they desire, and to see that, in fact, it's not truly happiness. Now, for St. Thomas, these last two, the punishments against habitual will and receiving what you desire, but which is unnatural. When the church speaks about temporal punishment, it's those last two she's talking about. When we talk about the temporal punishment of sin, it's these last two things. Right? Now, how do we satisfy for our sins? Satisfaction happens when we accept the punishment, not simply because we deserve it, but for some good. Right? To repair the order, to even for my own remediation, these are all goods, they're just secondary. To repair the order, remediation, as an act of love of God, as an offering act of begging forgiveness. Now, here's what you should note on this. It is impossible for us to satisfy and make satisfaction for our sins. Absolutely impossible. That's like Christianity 101, right? But we can unite our penances and our acts to Christ, because we're called to cooperate with Him in His grace. And that in itself can be satisfactory because He is satisfactory. He has made satisfaction. And so by God's charity, satisfaction can also be transformative for us and not simply something endured. Now, death. See, we're getting there. See how we're getting there. As I mentioned earlier, separated souls are deficient in a certain sense. And he's left the room, but I know Professor Tomaszewski, am I saying his name right? Has very strong opinions on this matter. Separate souls are deficient in a certain sense. No body, no senses, no phantasm. They're just intellectual and spiritual movements. So, there's arguments about how to understand this. One way to think about it is like they're kind of operating in a quasi-angelic way. I do not want you to, don't misinterpret me. I do not think we become angels. But for St. Thomas, the soul is receiving in the beatific vision direct species, impressed by the divine light. But it's still not really the person because the body is not there. Objectively, it's higher to be received knowledge straight from the beatific vision, but it's still, in fact, limited. Once we die, this is an important point, the soul is infallibly fixed. When the soul departs from the body, it will no longer be in a state of mobility toward the end, but of the resting in the end. Consequently, the will, as regards the desire for the ultimate end, will be immovable. All choices are made at that point. You're set. The soul is set. Time, one way to think about this is that time is kind of disconnected. There's no movement. Time is kind of disconnected after death, all right, from you. And at the moment of death, we believe that the soul knows itself without medium, without any sort of intermediary. It knows all that it has thought, desired, said, and done, both good and evil, to a very high degree. Right? And this is the same time as God's divine judgment. And the soul knows and accepts the judgment, even if the judgment is detestable for those who are judged to be damned. I'd recommend, for those of you who are into classics and music and beauty, because I know we have a lot of you here, John Cardinal Newman wrote a wonderful poem called The Dream of Gerontius. Has anyone heard of this? Yeah, The Dream of Gerontius, and Edward Elgar, the guy who did Pomp and Circumstance, put that to an oratorio. It's about a 3-hour recording, and it's all in English, but it's a poem about an old man, Gerontius, gerontology, who dies and is taken by his guardian angel to the judgment seat of God. And it's in England, it's the second most performed oratorio behind Handel's Messiah. Right? And there's about 5 different recordings throughout the 20th century that you can find on iTunes. If you're interested, see me after, I'll tell you which one I think is the best one. All right? But it's a great thing. Try to listen to it once a year. Like during Lent is a great time, to listen to it on a Sunday afternoon. The soul knows the judgment, but see, Gerontius, he gets there and he screams, being begged to take away to go to purgatory, because he knows he's not ready to stand before God. Right? And it sort of ends with his guardian angel, who's a soprano, taking him to purgatory, which Newman envisions as a warm ocean of water. And she's singing the soul's praises the whole time because he himself has recognized and accepted God's judgment. And she promises to come back and return him to the throne when he is fully cleaned and fully ready. It's really kind of beautiful. So St. John Cardinal Newman. So immediately, we believe we're sent to heaven, purgatory, or hell. Just want to give you this. I don't think I need to do this here at Belmont Abbey that much, but I'm going to as well anyway, because you might have people who are not Catholic who don't understand this. I gave this talk at a Protestant school once, and so I included these slides. But just so we're all aware where we see purgatory in some of the scriptures. Obviously, 2 Maccabees is one of the classic ones. Now, that's not going to help you with the Protestants because I don't think it's divinely inspired. But the Jews prayed for the deceased Jews who had given into the worship of idols. Matthew 12, whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either in this age or in the age to come. 1 Corinthians 3, if what has been built survives, the builder will be rewarded. If it burns down, the person will suffer loss. The person will be saved, though only passing through fire. That's kind of the key there, passing through fire to be saved. The practice of Christians from the very beginning, historically, to pray for the dead. And of course, both the councils of Florence and Trent infallibly declared the existence of purgatory in the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, why go to purgatory? There are 3 reasons generally that we might find ourselves in purgatory. First, unforgiven venial sins. Unforgiven mortal sins, you're not going to purgatory. Right? Now, we can talk a little bit about that later, but unforgiven venial sins, residual sinful dispositions, so being attached to sins. Think about all the addictions or the very sensual addictions, whether it's food, sex, drink, that you confess week every time you go to. I was going to say day in and day out, but every time you go to confession, but you try to do better, but you still like to do this or that. Those are residual sinful dispositions. St. Thomas has a great line about that because he says that you can't have acquired vices like the vice of lust if you're living in infused charity, because you have the infused virtue of temperance, and infused temperance cannot coexist with acquired lust. So, but what it does mean, he says, is that the moment you're forgiven from mortal sin and return to grace, the vice of lust is immediately destroyed, he says. But that doesn't mean you're off the hook, because what he says is a residual strong carnal disposition remains. And he says that, but then he says, which is beautiful, he says, but even that, as long as you live in grace, even that is in the process of being destroyed by grace. Right? Now here's the good news, of course. Those in purgatory, and the punishment due for the various sins we have, so all those temporal punishments, which is a big one. The good news is that those in purgatory are guaranteed heaven and the beatific vision. They're happier than you and I are. They're not going anywhere else. They're just going up. Right? The chief suffering of those in purgatory, for St. Thomas, is the delay of the beatific vision. That's what hurts them the most, what they suffer the most from. And they willingly suffer it. They willingly suffer this out of love for God and to be with Him in the end. Now, tradition has said this is a pain of sense, even though they do not have a body, because the soul is configured to receive pain of sense. So it is sort of a supernatural or imposed pain of sense. And tradition has often used the image of fire. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. St. Thomas has this vision, this image in the Summa Contra Gentiles, that the soul is in fact bound in fire, that the soul can't go where it wants to go. It can only go where the fire is. So it's like the souls of purgatory are like flicks of a flame off of a campfire. You know, that's what the souls in purgatory are. And the other point to maintain here is that God punishes us less than we deserve, always. Always, because we actually deserve infinite punishment. Because every sin is an offense against an infinite God. So every punishment is always less than what we deserve. Now, how long? How long do we spend in purgatory? Well, it's according to God's ratio, which is going to come together in a sort of meeting between satisfaction for the temporal punishments and our sins and the transformation, because punishment here in purgatory is actually achieving both ends. And remember, time is not really experienced in the same way. But we know that purgatory will not last after the general judgment. Charity is operating, the divine charity of God is operating in these suffering souls, and so they love God deeply. And they're being purified so that they can receive the most perfect happiness in which He calls them. And so they voluntarily and willingly love, in fact, to be purified in this way. They are not dreading it at every single moment because they see and understand the transformative element. This suffering as transformative, I just want to say this is a sort of a developing sort of view and read on St. Thomas, or that purgatory can be transformative as well as punishment. Joseph Ratzinger, who is definitely not a Thomist, has this great line in one of his, I think in this book on the eschatology. He says that purgatory is the place where God puts the pieces of our life back together again and makes right what we never could. So all the baggage, all the regrets, all the pains, all the things we wish we could forgive or be forgiven for. Because see, in the end, and this is why purgatory is so important for our understanding, is that we believe that the beatific vision is perfect happiness without sorrow. This is not the Lutheran simul justus et peccator, where you stand before God well aware that you're a sinner. We believe standing before God in the beatific vision for all eternity, there will be no ounce of sadness or regret, but completely purified. We will be able to stand, He's given us the gift to transform us from the inside out, to make us more like Him, so that, in fact, we stand before Him for all eternity in complete awe and amazement, but also in complete love and joy without any sense of shame or regret. And that's a much more beautiful view of what heaven is with God. So this idea that suffering is transformative is why a lot of modern sort of thinkers, even solid people like Ratzinger, tend to shy away from the fire language because it seems contrary that fire is what would cause us to be enlightened. They want to focus more on the transformative element of our life. Finally, I just want to say two more things and then we'll stop, and I realize I've gone a little bit over here. Just indulgences. Just want to say quite clearly that indulgences come from the merits of Christ and the saints, primarily the merits of Christ and His work in the saints, but they're distributed by the church. And just so you know, if you're not into these things, these are very important things, and that there are plenary and partial indulgences. And a plenary indulgence requires, complete detachment from sin. Right? Now, there's a good question whether anyone can get a plenary indulgence because of that, because of that condition. That means you don't even have any affection for any of your favorite sins when you're doing the act. Right? You despise them, you hate them. Plenary indulgence. Receiving communion once for each plenary indulgence act, and having gone to confession a few days before, a few days after the act. You can only receive one plenary indulgence a day. The plenary indulgence can be for yourself or a dead person. It takes away all temporal punishment. Okay. Partial indulgences, the church says, are partial to the extent that you do them and perform them in charity. So it's like a proportion. They can be more or less effective, right? I want to encourage you then also to pray for the dead and pray for those in purgatory. And then finally, just the two things. What can we do on this life as we work our way to the next, into judgment? Well, obviously, prayer, penance, and works of mercy to help work off and to be transformed by these things, to work off the temporal punishments of sin. And by intentionally asking God for the grace to grow, to be more united to Him more and more. And then last, I just want to give you two works I think that you might enjoy if you're interested in this sort of thing. First is, of course, the great sacred monster of Thomism, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. Okay, so his book, Life Everlasting, a theological treatise on the last things. Just find the purgatory section. You're going to find a lot of great things on Thomas. But then there's a new book that was just published last year. Luke Wilgenbush, Saved as Through Fire, a Thomistic Account of Purgatory, Temporal Punishment, and Satisfaction. And with that, I will conclude, and I guess if there's time for questions, I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you. Yes? Yeah, so that's a good question. I'll repeat it so everyone can hear it. But when you read these indulgences about X amount of time, so when Pope Paul VI, St. Paul VI, reissued what's called the Incridium Indulgentiorum, the Manual of Indulgences, which is still published, it's in its 4th edition, recommend you find it, it's on Kindle, and read it. It's basically a handbook of approved prayers and practices by the Church. He specifically, in his constitution approving that, said he was getting away from attaching days to partial indulgences, precisely because it can turn the thing into a commercial exchange, like it can seem transactional. And so that's why he's kind of shifted to simply saying there are plenary indulgences and there are partial indulgences, and partial indulgences are effective to the proportion that you do them in charity and fully intentionally. Does that make sense? So, but I think when they were having days attached to them, like 1,356 days, I mean, there was a and there's still a sort of sense, because this is our only mode of reference, because we tend to think of purgatory as like a prison. Well, how much time am I going to serve? But when you look at the sort of view of purgatory as something that's also about transformation and, not entirely bound by the limits of time that we're in, and about relationship with God, it becomes less about serving time and more about what it is, which is purification, and transformation. And how much time that takes. That's why I kind of sloughed over that because I felt like we were going a little long. How long you're in there is really part of God's own ratio of the satisfaction and the transformation that He has from all time predestined that you would have. Right? So, yeah, I think this is all complicated because He also knows that some people might get some plenary indulgences for you. And that's all figured into His eternal, infinite ratio on the whole thing. Yes?
Yeah, you had mentioned how our unforgiven sins, venial sins, are considered purgatory. So that's the first I've heard of it before, that if venial sins are forgiven, you won't have to go to purgatory.
Well, yeah, so I'd say that's one of the reasons. That was one of the reasons. Like, so even if your venial sins are forgiven, you could still have temporal punishments due, like attachments to those venial sins. And so you'd still have to do purgatory for that if you still have those when you die, even though the venial sins are forgiven. Because just because the sins are forgiven, mortal or venial, doesn't mean while the guilt is forgiven and the punishment associated to the sin is forgiven, what we call temporal punishments, and even though we're using that term, temporal punishment, it still means, if I can put it in contemporary psychological language, it still means you have baggage. You're going to die with your baggage, all right? Unless you get rid of your baggage before you die, which is, I think personally, is exceedingly hard to do apart from real spiritual intentionality and grace. And purgatory is about the place where the baggage is finally taken away, but not just taken away like you just forget about it, but where it's incorporated into your whole existence in a positive way, right? I mean, think about it this way. When we die, and even as we live, we all have memories of whether disputes, things we've said to people or done to people, things people done to us. Look, especially as you get older, it's not like it's peanuts. You don't even hold a grudge anymore. But occasionally you'll be sitting around and this memory will come up, and you're like, I still can't believe he did that. That's a temporal punishment. That's my baggage. You see, I don't want to be thinking about that in the beatific vision.
So if the baggage hasn't cleared on her,
That's right. Is that helpful? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm teaching a course on Dante's Divine Comedy, so of course I'm on a Dante note here, and a lot of this is so pairs so well, of course. It undergirds the entire metaphysical foundation of Divine Comedy. However, I do find that with Dante there's a slightly different emphasis in terms of what purgation means, maybe psychologically speaking. So I think of C.S. Lewis's line that heaven is an acquired taste.
Yeah, I think that's great. I love that. Yeah.
Right, which is to say that the delights of heaven would be unpalatable to us now.
That's right.
As we are. And Dante really seems to emphasize that, right? That this is about the purification of desire in an Augustinian sort of way, to love and do what you will, right? Is that a significant difference in that?
That's a good.
Benefit from reading Dante's verse.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, yeah, I obviously have subscribed to that myself. Now, I'm not sure if I'm prepared to say St. Thomas does, because I think that, in fact, this is Wilgenbusch's argument. He thinks the transformative element is only nascent in St. Thomas's writing. This kind of transformation of desire, transformation of the person is only nascent in there, which is, I think, is probably right. I'm not sure, but I think today, like if the conversation had continued, I'm sure he would have come to this. Dante, and I'm not a Dante scholar, but I know that there's strong connections between Dante and Thomas's theology, right? So I think it's great, and I think that's right. I mean, I love the Great Divorce, where the people at the stop, which seems like as a kind of purgatory, right? Like they don't know they're not in heaven. Like they can't figure it out. So I would agree with. I'd probably agree with this interpretation of Dante. And is it a significant difference? Yeah, probably. I mean, I don't think St. Thomas got there quite as efficiently. There's a great Twilight Zone episode that runs along these lines. A gambler dies and he wakes up and he knows he's a bad man. He's a gambler. Spends all of his money gambling, and he wakes up and his guardian angel is there, and he's immediately it's over. Well, I know I'm going to that bad place. But if you talk to the big guy, if you could give me, I'd be really grateful. So the guardian angel takes him to this lavish hotel, beautiful casino, and the gambler's like, "It's amazing. I don't know what I did for the big guy to give me this, but I'm so glad I'm here and not in the other place, the bad place." But of course, the moral of the story is, it's a casino that actually has no possibility of losing. He wins every poker game. He wins every slot machine. The roulette wheel stops at every number he bets on, and 2 days he can't stand it. So he's calling the guardian angel. You got to ask him, I'm thankful, but I want to go to the other place. I want to go to the bad place. And of course, then the angel reveals to him, actually, this is where you are. So there's a question back there. Yeah. I think so. I'm not sure. His questions on purgatory, because he never really, he stops the Summa before he gets to the purgatory questions, right? So you got the Summa Contra Diles, you got a little bit in the De Malo. And then there's, obviously he talks about it in the commentary on the sentences. The problem with the commentary on the sentences is that not only was it his first work, it's not always clear when you're reading, is he reporting his own position or is he simply reporting on is he giving you a catalog of positions? He's not always clear on that. But I do think seems like it is the teaching of the church that those in purgatory have a greater awareness and knowledge of God than we do as the church militant here. So I would want to hold that. I mean, one of the interesting questions that Thomas does play with is whether the suffering souls can know that we're praying for them. And I think the jury's out on that. I think the jury's kind of out on that. I think he sensed no. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think the jury's out on that. I mean, I wonder, for instance, my parents have gone to God. We had complicated relationships, but they both died very good, holy deaths. I kind of got to wonder. Now, there's no data for revelation on this, so it's just speculative. Could it be part of their purification to know that their priest son is often saying masses for them? Even as they think of all the ways perhaps that they could have been better parents or the way that I could have been a better child. And does that make sense, And to see how even with all of that history, it still worked out somehow that I became a priest, and not a horrible one, yeah.
One of the requirements to gaining plenary indulgence is to go to confession.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good question. You guys hear that one of the requirements of the plenary indulgence that you go to confession before or after, and traditionally they would always say, well, how many days before? And then there's been different numbers given, 20, days before or after. But in theory, yes, if you haven't committed a mortal sin since going to confession, or if you've made an act of contrition with the intention of going to confession, if you have, you have to be in grace to get any indulgence, partial or plenary, right? And I'd say if you've committed a mortal sin, go to confession before you try to engage in any plenary indulgence work, right? But yes, you can get, if you're in grace, one plenary indulgence a day and hang those on one confession. But you can only hang one plenary indulgence on one Eucharistic communion. Yeah, communion every day. If you're going to get 20 in 20 days, you have to go to communion every day and do an indulgence to work every day. And remember, you also got to pray for the Pope's intentions when you do, seek for an indulgence. Yeah?
Does the church have a tradition of when we pray for souls in purgatory, and we don't know for sure whether maybe they've already preached heaven by now?
Yeah.
Maybe they make purgatory.
Yep.
What happens to those prayers?
I know, I love that question. I mean, and there's all sorts of wonderful little pious answers to that, right? Did you guys hear that? What happens to the prayers if you're praying for your mother and she's been long gone from purgatory for years, I think that's where the kind of beautiful thing is, right? That somehow God allows us, not just in this life, but in the life to come, allows us to somehow cooperate in His work in purifying the souls of the faithful departed, right? By praying for them and doing indulgence works for them. And I got to believe that is not purely transactional for Him, so that grace and what the grace that we're sort of meriting by cooperating with Christ is somehow used in a way that only He wills and that He's... So traditionally what people say, well, it goes to my mother, or it goes to the next neediest soul, But yeah, it's an interesting question.
So, that is correct. You said you willingly accept the suffering.
Oh yeah.
So, and there's more question about knowledge at that point. So if someone dies, is in purgatory, but never had purgatory explained to that, versus me having come here tonight, do I have knowledge to actually get through quicker?
Right. So that's a good question. Yeah. So I would say I want to be careful about saying how you would get slower or quicker through purgatory. I'd want to get, because obviously that's a presumption I don't want to make. I will say this though about knowledge in this life and carrying over into the next. This is the, so I'm deflecting your question to answer a question I think is more interesting. So this thing about like you here tonight versus the deathbed convert who's never heard anything other than Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And sometimes it's presented, well, geez, why are you guys wasting all this time? Well, because it's about not simply getting into heaven and staying out of hell. That's level one. I mean, yes, that's an important goal. That should be your goal. But that shouldn't just be your goal. The more we know God in this life, and the closer we grow to God in this life, the more we will enjoy Him and in union with Him in the next, right? So think about, in the old teaching, we spoke about levels in heaven. Not everyone is equal even in heaven. Think about St. Therese of Lisieux, her image of the cups, right? Some people are going to have small cups and some people are going to have big cups. But they'll all be full. And everyone, the deathbed convert, he'll be full. He knows he's going to be full. He won't care that you got more than he does because he's got all he can have. And he'll be happy and wonderful. But because you spent this life growing in holiness, growing in knowledge, you're going to be able to take in, so to speak, more of the beatific vision than the deathbed convert. You're going to be able to soak in more. You know, being a Dominican, of course, I like questions. I like to think of if the beatific vision. This is a very limited view. I'm acknowledging that right now. If the beatific vision is going to be an opportunity for me to ask God all the questions I've ever always had, I'm going to have a lot more questions and different kinds of questions than the deathbed convert. I mean, and this is not pride to say it. My questions are going to be categorically on a different level than the deathbed converts, right? Now, that's also true, though, of the charity that I would have. I'm presuming I'm going to continue on, and God will give me the grace to persevere in all of this, and I will love and grow. Your soul will grow, right? I mean, that's kind of the point of the spiritual life, is not just to get get into heaven and stay out of hell. It's actually to grow the size of your soul, so to speak. There was someone over here, yeah.
Kind of a technical question about indulgences. Like, why can we not gain indulgences for people who are alive at earth, but we can gain them dead?
Well, so St. Thomas has this, like, in the questions on grace in the Summa, can you merit grace for another person? All right? And it was typical of these questions for St. Thomas, yes and no. Yes, in as much as if they're already in grace, you know, your prayers for them can be efficacious and actually earn them and get them more grace. But you cannot merit satisfaction for them or conversion for them. And so indulgences presume, when we give indulgences to the deceased, presume rightly that the person is in grace, is in a state of being purified, and is actually progressing towards God in a way that cannot be presumed. And in fact, that is not happening even it's apples and oranges, even for the Christian. Like, you know, you trying to give an indulgence to me. You don't know, even though I'm a priest and seem like a nice guy, you don't know if I'm prepared to receive that purification. Whereas those in purgatory are in a constant state of receiving the purification that indulgences bring. Yes?
You talked about punishment as a restoration of order. Can you talk about what you mean exactly by that? Because I guess in my mind, you talked about that as primarily, because in my mind it seems that wouldn't the transformative aspect necessarily be part of the restoration?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the transformative aspect would be part of the restoration. But restoration considered, or retribution considered in its own terms, is simply saying that the order was disturbed by the act and now needs to be made right, needs to be put right. Now, when you're talking about civil justice or natural justice in this world, you can only do that so far. So think about how a murderer, you know, offends the right order, not only society, but of the life of the victim's family. There's no putting that back completely. But there is a sense in which society's order requires a punishment that is commensurate in order that it not be seen. And this is different than deterrence. That in fact, we don't act this way. This is not a properly ordered life to live this way. And if you do certain things, you're going to suffer greater consequences, right? So I think but we have forgotten that. I think in the modern world, we tend to think of punishment only as medicinal, rehabilitation, and deterrence. But the classical understanding of punishment is that first and foremost, it's retributive. And everything else is secondary. Yes?
So you mentioned how our sins are against God, and therefore it's kind of an infinite kind of thing, and any kind of, you cannot merit the satisfaction. So if our sins are kind of infinite and the punishment is kind of finite, how can that finite redemption then satisfy God?
Because it's united to the infinite satisfaction of Christ. So when you go to confession and get penance, I mean, the idea is the penance is a sort of satisfaction for the sins you've confessed. However, there is no way that saying 3 Hail Marys satisfies for the sins you've confessed, right? There's no way saying 1,000 Hail Marys is going to satisfy, even though it might be tedious and painful. But in the sacrament of confession, the absolution and the penance are connected to the infinite satisfaction of Jesus Christ on the cross. And because of that, your act united to his is in fact satisfaction. Because he is the primary operator of this satisfaction in which you are now cooperating and participating in. But it is not an equal transaction. Maybe one last question. Does that sound good, Truman? Yep, one last question. Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit of that early in the talk. So these are questions. So St. Thomas has these questions, like, is the way that God saved us, created us, and redeemed us the best way, right? And he says, of course, there are an infinite number of ways salvation could have worked out. I mean, honestly, God could have snapped his fingers and everything would have been fine. But for St. Thomas, this is a question where he uses language of fittingness. It is fitting, conveniens est, which is to say it's also beautiful. And he thinks that the way God has done this is the most perfect way, because God never does anything less than the perfect way. So therefore, that there is something good and beautiful and wonderful about not only there being a fall, but being thousands of years before a Redeemer, and with baptism, and us being able to live for now 2,000 years, dealing with the sufferings of original sin, dealing with our own sins, seeking God, growing in love, becoming witnesses to others to come to know him. That the whole thing is symphonic. Now, St. Thomas does say, and I mentioned this in the talk, I'll just repeat them, that the 3 reasons why he suggests that baptism doesn't take away the problems of the body is 1, precisely because this gives us an opportunity to suffer with Christ and to participate in some small way in the sufferings he endured for our sins. Secondly, because suffering is transformative, right, and can help us to grow. And then third, his position, remember, that if baptism took away everything, like arthritis and growing old and pain and colds and painful childbirth and all of that, people might get baptized for that reason and not for an authentically true reason. Right. This has been wonderful. Thank you for that. So I went long, and but this has been great questions. Thank you. Great.
Well, thank you again, Father, and thank you to everybody for coming out. If you are interested in attending more of the Mystic Institute events and group me, don't fall in the same group me, but come ask me, and I'll figure out how to add you. Also, if you're interested in serving on our team, we'd be grateful to have you. You know, need some more help. Good night.
Yeah, let's see.
Thanks, Father. That's great.
Thank you.